Professor Anne Toomey is a constitutional law expert and she joined us just a little earlier. Anne Toomey, always a pleasure to get your insights on the program. I might start with the Prime Minister, who perhaps inadvertently generated a bit of debate and discussion about the constitutional amendment for the voice when he says it preserves, quote, the primacy of Parliament for what the voice will consider. Now, taken at face value, are those words correct or incorrect?
Oh, well, it's about half right. So the words were intended to ensure the primacy of Parliament, but in fact directed at something slightly different, and that is making sure that it's Parliament that decides how the voice's representations are dealt with. So it gets to decide whether or not the executive is required to consider those representations in some cases in relation to certain decisions and not others. So that's where parliamentary primacy was at issue quite recently. But the bit about whether, what sort of things the voice can itself consider and make representations about, that's actually put into constitutional terms in the second paragraph, and that says that they can make representations with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and because that's set out in the Constitution, the Parliament can't change that bit. So it was slightly off-piste there. I suspect it was more a question of, just not quite getting the words out of your mouth right, which happens to me all the time.
It happens to all of us, I can guarantee you that. If we just focus in on Clause 3 then, functions and powers, and if they are for the Parliament to decide, is it possible then, or desirable even, to define in legislation a list of areas of responsibility that the voice may make representations on?
Well, you could, but would still have to be within the scope of what's set out in the second paragraph. So the second paragraph guarantees a couple of things. One is that the voice is able to make representations to the executive and to Parliament. And secondly, that those representations can be about matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, the Parliament can, of course, make further legislation about those functions, and that could be about how you make those representations, who they're made to. Do you channel all the representations about the executive government into one central holding house, which you might do for sensible reasons? Do you send them all to Parliament and a parliamentary committee so that they're tabled? So you can legislate about all those things, and you could also highlight the sorts of things that you think should be the main focus of the voice. So you could suggest that it has, a primary role to deal with certain sorts of things, but you couldn't legislate in a way to take away its ability to make representations to the executive and the Parliament, or to take away its ability to make representations about matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because that's guaranteed.
But perhaps under some scenario in the future where political pressure was being exerted, would it be possible for a government to exclude areas, well, for instance, to use two topically in the mix this week, foreign and defence policy, perhaps throw in cyber security, which many might argue are only marginally associated with Indigenous well-being? Could a Parliament go about excluding those areas?
Well, the first question is whether or not they would fall within that category of matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we know that category would cover A, laws directly relating to Aboriginal people, so laws that specifically refer to them. B, laws of general application that have a differential or a specific impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So they would clearly fall within the scope of matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We're not absolutely sure where the end of that scope is, so it's possible that if anybody bothered to challenge the voice and said, well, you're not acting within your power because you're making laws about defence or whatever, you could bring that challenge, and, who knows precisely what a court would say. But the really important thing here to point out is the real issue is not whether or not the voice makes a representation. The real issue is, do you have an obligation to consult on it or to respond to it or consider it? All right, and that's where the legislation comes in. So legislation could say, well, there is no obligation to consider or respond to any representation made by the voice on matters concerning defence.
Would you
can do that, and that's not a problem.
Would you encourage the insertion of sentences that deal with obligations or no obligation?
Well, that was the issue about the third subsection. So you might remember there were some earlier words that were proposed by the attorney that said that specifically that Parliament would be able to deal with how you deal with the legal effect of those representations. That got slightly changed to a little bit more oblique formulation, which just says that Parliament has the power to make laws with respect to the voice. But that has been interpreted by the government, and it's in the explanatory memorandum to make it clear that that is intended to include the power to deal with any potential obligations. I'm satisfied that the explanatory memorandum and the second reading speech make clear that that terminology in the third paragraph is intended to achieve that. Could you have written a different way to make it clearer? Well, yes, you could. But the government's chosen those words and the intention behind those words is clear. So if the High Court was looking at this in the future, it would look at not only the words but also the intention as expressed by the government in the second reading speech and explanatory memorandum, and I think that's sufficient.
All right, well, look, the next step is going to be examination by a parliamentary committee, and I'm sure that will focus in around those words in executive government, and somehow I suspect, Ann Toomey, that you'll be called to give further testimony to that committee. So we'll leave it there and maybe catch up around that occasion in the future.
Thank you.